All right, so we're back with rocks and time, stratigraphy, layers of rock. When we talked last, we were more or less just talking specifically about the beds themselves, the layers themselves. And I didn't get too much into, believe it or not, the interpretation of. All right. And I did mention it a handful of times, don't get me wrong. But that's really what stratigraphy is all about. It's not really a whole lot of use if you just go through and point out the layers of rock. We want to analyze them, interpret them, so on and so forth. So we move on to the second half of this, and some of it is just straight that, and some of it is a little more clue digging, CSI kind of stuff like we talked about before. So what you need to remember, first and foremost, is that these layers equal time. Okay. How much time? When the rock is out of context, it can be almost impossible to tell. When it's in context, in other words, still in nature, in the layers, it can be a little easier to tell. All right, but still, figuring out what I mean is whether this is each layer is a week, each layer is a month or a year or whatever. And then, believe it or not, they can, by looking at various things, they could say seasonality. Okay. I was just reading, I get weird articles. I was just reading there was a huge scandal in the paleontological world semi-recently. And two people fighting over a dig site in South Dakota or somewhere, we'll just say. And wasn't that necessarily anyone was falsifying data or anything, but that possibly somebody stole somebody else's technique, back and forth. Yeah, potentially. But what they were actually going over was whether or not they could tell the seasons through these layers even, which is pretty freaking insane. They both claim to have done it. It's just, who did it first. They worked together and then had an argument, and it went from there, of course. And as I always say in those, there's at least, as I would say in those situations, there's at least three sides, right? One person's the other person's, and the real one, and then, God only knows how many more. But, so we may never really know. But the idea was that not only can we apparently now wonder how long the layer equals, we could potentially tell, well, this layer was laid down in the spring, or this layer was laid down in the fall. And it's not unheard of. We could do it with tree rings, right? They talk about, seasons for growth and so on and so forth. So somebody applied that technology. But so these people really get into it at any rate. Something else to keep in mind is that when that layer was being deposited, it was the surface. Now, whether the surface is up here with us, down at the bottom of the ocean floor, that's still the surface. A lot of times you have trouble with that. You're like, well, it's the bottom of the ocean floor. That's not the surface of the earth. It sort of still is. Yeah, arguably the ocean, top of the ocean is the surface as well. But again, these people think differently than we do. But since it was at the surface, life was happening on it and around it and so on and so forth. And that's why we find fossils. That's why we could find something we'll talk about a little later, ripple marks to say, oh, this was a wave producing area and so on and so forth. And once you start not just saying, oh, this is that stupid rock I have to remember, but, oh, yeah, this stupid rock has layers. Oh, wait, those layers equal time. Okay, yeah. Wait, if that equals a layer was time, then that was like my desktop at some point and somebody was writing on it. And you get kind of deep kind of quick if you are so inclined. And so what that all boils down to then is that time is indicated by rocks. Okay. So, of course, we can't keep it that simple. Generally speaking, when you see what we call an outcrop, when you see rocks, You don't just see a single rock, you see a set of layers, right? Again, if you've had the opportunity to get on the thruway and drive towards Albany, more than likely you've passed that cliff right around Little Falls that is on our lab book. If you've had the opportunity to head down towards Poughkeepsie, you've gone down 80 whatever that is over there, where they have rocks in between the northbound and the southbound at some point. All right, so I want you to picture, or if you've gone up north to the Adirondack, I want you to picture a cliff, okay, a series of rocks. And we walk around horizontally for the most part on this planet. Sometimes you go rock climbing, but we're not talking about that now. Horizontally. And we talked about this with lateral continuity. You change environments as you walk horizontally, right? You park your car, you start in the parking lot, then you go into a field, then maybe that field turns into woods, that woods goes to a lake or a stream. And that all makes sense to us. Now, you kind of need to mentally stay in that parking lot and then fast forward or rewind tens of thousands of years, 100,000 years. And imagine how that landscape has changed right where you were. Obviously, it wasn't always a parking lot. Was it the woods? All right, well then what came before the woods? Maybe it was a field before that. Maybe it was a swamp. Maybe it was a marsh. And all these things, but right where you are. And that would pile up, right? All those different environments would pile up on top of you. So that's sort of the idea when we see these cliff faces, these rock faces. All right, it's one point in time one point through lots of time. So we've got, I don't know, read that, yeah, it's big enough probably. You got the sandstone, you got the shale, and you got the limestone, okay? The three symbols you're familiar with. We got limestone on the bottom, we got shale, and you got sandstone, all right? And again, we did mention this the other day just a little bit. So the idea is if you were able to stand, in the middle of this column, you can't, but just imagine, pretend. Since before the limestone got there, all right, where do we tell you limestone forms? Specific kind of water even, too. So yeah, salt water. All right, so we'll cut to the chase and call that the ocean. So you're under, and also fairly deep water, too. All right. So you're in an ocean here, and the water's fairly deep. Then it turns to shale. I almost gave the word away, mud, right? We know shale is mud, and we tend to associate muds with nearshore environments. Then, 10,000 years later, I'm just making up numbers here, 10,000 years later, all of a sudden you've got sand being deposited right where you're standing. Where do we tend to associate, in a marine environment at least, where do we tend to associate sand with? The beach. Okay. So where you're standing over time has become deep water, shallow water, and then tidal zone. What's happening in this environment? Water's receding, right. All right, now if we flip this, you're standing in sand 100,000 years ago, then 50,000 years ago, you're standing in mud, and then recently, you're standing underwater. What can you say about that environment? Rising, okay. That's a one simple example of what's going on here. All right, and the idea, yes, we're basing this on solely one factor, rock type. There's way more to it, but it's a 100 level class. All right. So these transitions from one rock type to another indicate changes in environment, and in this case, the one I've given you, because I think it's just easiest to understand. Not because I'm pushing any agenda or anything like that, but it is really simple to understand. We're talking about the shoreline moving, or the water levels receding or rising. Well, we're in science, so we've got special words for that. We got transgression and regression. And well, yeah, you could probably use both of those in a sentence if you want. Putting them in context is a little harder. And of the two of these, regression stands out probably as the easiest one. We talked about sea level rising and sea level receding. Which one of those do you think regression is? Yeah, receding. So transgression must be rising. All right. It's transgressing onto land. It's receding from the land. Regressing from the land, sorry. I guess the gression is constant in both. May as well stick with that. So here's kind of what we've been talking about. Again, you see your three rock types there. The first one, if you can't tell, is the little dots. Then you've got the dashes, then the bricks. So if you were able to walk out, let's say you had a scuba kit on or something, all right, you're not worried about water going over your head, that's what you would encounter. Now, there's nothing over there in the clear. There would be something, but we stop our example there. So then if we were to, do I have a slide for this before I just talk about it? It does not look like it. So if we were to raise the ocean levels, which way would those dashed rocks go? To the left or to the right, if we were to raise sea level? See the dashed rocks in the middle? To the left. Anyone disagree? So arguably then if we were to lower sea level then, the dashed rocks would go to the right. Yeah. How many of you still aren't on board with this example? Don't quite know what the hell we're talking about. Because this is application level stuff. We hardly ever jump to this level of Bloom's taxonomy here. And that's unfortunate, but it is the nature of the beast of a survey level class, right? But we have an opportunity here to not just throw vocabulary at you, but kind of, use it in a certain limited way here. So if we move the dashed lines to the left, if we raise sea level, you see then that the next deposit on top of the sand will be the shale. The limestone arguably would get deposited where the shale used to get deposited. And not just that, when they go through and they cut out a road and you see these stacks of rocks, and we're trying to understand what's happening vertically here, but you should also be able to see these changes then horizontally. If you go down the road or up the road, you should see then the shale to limestone happen, just like you see the sandstone to shale transition happen where you're standing. You should be able to move, again, depending on how the road's situated and so on and so forth, the rock cut is situated, one direction to the other and see this other transition, because everything should move. Now we're keeping it, as I said, really, really simple, really, for illustrative purposes, educative purposes only here. Again, think back to those shales that are at the Little Falls exit. And again, if you don't know the Little Falls exit, it's you should try and get there. Pay a friend a cheeseburger to drive you over there. All right, but it's a whole lot of shale, so that puts us sort of in the middle here. All right, mixed in with that shale is some limestone. It's the creamy layers, like little bricks. So we see some of that going on back then. But again, now we've jumped. I keep just making up numbers. I could just open my lab book. You think I'd remember. Now we've jumped, is it 380 million years? 450 million years. The photos on the front and back cover of this text were taken on the New York State Thruway. Actually, we changed the back photo. Exit 29A, Little Falls, they show a wonderful road cut outcrop of the Utica Shale, which is Ordovician in age. The shale represents shallow seabed deposits roughly 450 million years old. The one on the back is now over, if you guys have ever gone with your family, like to Wild Center, up north. There's an ancient forest. It's one of the few stands of old-growth forest left in New York State. That and Green Lakes, actually, if you've been to Green Lake in DeWitt. Beautiful stuff, and it looks different. Definitely does. At any rate, so 450 million years, and then there's nothing for 450 million years. All right. So when they start building rocks back up again, should they start building rocks back up again, there's going to be a huge gap, and that goes way back in the slides. We're not going to do that, but remember the context. Okay. And in that case, whatever rock ends up getting deposited on top of the shales at Little Falls, there's a gap of 450 million years. Somebody's going to have to recognize that. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. So that's how this all ties together. And if you were digging that, I apologize, we're going to change gears. If you were totally lost and not saying anything, you'll probably be happy that we're changing gears. But before we change gears, any questions about the whole rocks and time and interpreting them, and all the senators are lying to you, and oh no, I said I didn't have an agenda, sorry. And all that stuff. Politicians lie, I know, it's shocking, isn't it? I'm so sick of everyone arguing on Facebook. They're a liar. Yeah, no shit, they're liars. Both sides are lying to you. Just which lies do you prefer? You know. Sorry, no politics. Week from elections, it's tough. All right, so sedimentary structures. Remember I told you that each and every one of those layers, for some amount of time, was the surface. Okay? Whether it's the surface of the seafloor, surface of a beach, surface of a desert, surface of wherever. So critters are walking around on it. Things are living, things are dying, things are pooping, things are digging up, things are just doing everything on it and in it. We're throwing up Walmarts. We're carving out mines. We're doing stuff to it. If sedimentation happens in that area, all right, that stuff can get buried and preserved. You're going to be familiar with some of these. Some of these will be new. A little tech talk here, of course. These were formed after deposition, but before lithification. What does that mean? Well, the dirt had to be there, but we didn't want to turn it into a rock yet. Again, duh, but we got to say it. And again, it just helps us put a little context onto into the rocks. All right. What do we got here? And don't just say trace fossil. I know that it's written on there. What do we think we got there? A footprint. All right. Any other potential interpretations? What else does it kind of look like? Kind of looks like a leaf. I agree. Anybody else? So, last call. Anybody else? Okay, well, still arguably then a footprint, or is it some other part of the bird? You think it is the bird? Okay. All right. So, it can kind of look like a bird, I guess. I see like the wings and then the head in the center. Kind of thing. Or are you still going for footprint? That is of a bird. Well, we're getting to that. All right. So, let's say we can agree on two main hypotheses here. This is a footprint or this is a leaf. Why is it probably not a leaf? I led you right to that. This is the conversation I wanted to have. It's depth. Yeah, that'd have to be one hell of a leaf, right? Okay. So it's implied thickness. It's kind of hard to tell 3D on here, but it looks like it has some depth to it. We also see the potential for some toe claws there, but again, some leaves have little pointy ends. You never know. Cats have pointy ears on tips on their ears too. Little hairs there. It could be anything here. It could be a 3-eared cat. We don't know yet. So we have the depth, and that's a really good argument. We also have, if you look towards the bottom of the picture, we have what looks to be a bit of a heel impression. We've got the depth. We keep going back to that. We've got 3 toes. We know birds tend to have 3-toed feet. This would be a pretty big bird. But again, it could be a bird. And we know something that we think is supposed to be very similar to birds that we used to have. What? Big, tall, scary birds. Dinosaurs, yeah. All right. And somebody opened with that a couple minutes ago. It's a dinosaur footprint. I've seen it. Well, yep, but we got to, again, pretend we don't necessarily know what we're looking at here, and we want to think about what we could easily confuse this with, or at least potentially confuse this with. But is it the dinosaur? Going back to my question with Nika there a couple minutes ago, was it the bird? No, it's not the bird, it's not the dinosaur, it's the footprint of the dinosaur. And that's what trace fossils are. Not necessarily footprints, but they're evidence that an organism was in the area. Be it a footprint, be it a burrow, be it any kind of evidence. Fossilized poop. All right, every little kid loves coprolites. We're in Arizona this summer. Oh, I got to put those pictures in there. I actually went to a coprolite museum. For those of you that don't know, coprolites are fossilized poop. Okay, and they're all through the rock record. And they got poop from this and poop from that, and so on and so forth. This guy was making a killing too. I hope he makes it past the first year. But Winslow, Arizona. We had to stop because of the Eagles song, But standing on a corner. That one. So he was right there on the corner, and he was getting a lot of traffic, and he was selling all kinds of poop-related merchandise. I don't usually get into that kind of humor, but it was cool to see all the fossils. So any kind of evidence that an organism was there is a trace fossil. The correct word you hardly ever hear is the ichthyofossil. Okay. What is that a trace fossil of? Yeah, tire track. Probably. Right? Could be. I used to have one that was a footprint. I'm not sure what happened to that one. But it's in mud. Imagine that. What kind of rock would that turn into if it were not, next to a curb in a parking lot? Yeah, that would be shale with a tire track in it, just like you guys saw shale with the little plant fossils in it. This one's funny, and you might not have ever thunk of it. Years ago, I used to have, I don't want to say free time, but I didn't have kids yet, and it was a little more free in life. And I used to go to a lot more conferences. And I don't know if I was at a paleontological conference or just a geology conference. I also go to science teacher conferences when I'm allowed to do stuff. And so I was walking by, and they've always had programs, but oh God, there's so many things in there. So I just wander around and read, postings on doors, little signs and whatnot to see what looks interesting. And I walked by one that said, predatory snails of the Cretaceous. Predatory snails. Not exactly come to mind when you think of predators, right? Cougars and pumas and tigers and all that stuff. But a snail. Huh. So, of course, I had to go in. And it also happened to be, the name of the paleontologist was Ross Geller, and which at the time, Friends was like totally on the air. And I'm like, wait a minute, they don't have David Schwimmer here giving a presentation as Ross Geller here. This is silly. This poor unfortunate man actually was named the same as the kid on Friends who was supposed to be a paleontologist. It's kind of strange. So at any rate, I sat down and listened to Ross's conversation. And it turns out there are a few things in the planet that a snail can predate. And one of them is a seashell that's attached to a rock, because it ain't running away anywhere. Snails are vicious. If you've ever had or still have a fish tank or aquarium, I recommend getting a snail. They're very cool to watch. They're much closer than cartoons, or much faster than cartoons have led you to believe over the years. They could actually cover a decent amount of space in a short amount of time. But much more cool is their mouth. All right? And their mouth is a little suction-y tube. But inside of that is a circular set of teeth. It's called a rasper. And it basically, if you've ever drilled a doorknob hole on a door, it's the same idea. All right, and it just circles back and forth, and drills a hole through seashells and slurps out the yummy insides. Vicious critters. So back to the point, we're talking about trace fossils. Now this isn't even a fossil; it's still original content here. This seashell you're looking at, but it's a great example. If you were to find this in the fossil record, the fossil would be the shell, but we have a trace fossil showing evidence of predation, so we know that there were vicious snails in the area who love to eat cockle shells, or whatever this guy happens to be. So, point being that sometimes these things can be stacked, okay? You can see gnaw marks on a tree if you go to, let's just say you randomly find a piece of fossilized wood, and it's shaped in a really odd way. This would be really rare, but you could arguably find gnaw marks from a beaver, okay, and imply that there were beavers in the area, and so on and so forth. Not uncommon, we do this going back to the CSI stuff, teeth marks on bones when they find a body. Okay, it's the same idea. Hopefully they're not human. Sometimes they are. What I have here. Oh, I was really pushing the whole snail thing, but I have a little video. And I don't know if it's going to transfer over to my recorder. I hope it's recording my screen, so it should. Now, you guys don't see it, though. Yeah, this is where it always happens. So let me X out. The people on the recorder can see it. And now can you guys see the snail? All right. So we'll watch this snail real quick. It's just a quickie video. Probably David Attenborough or something like that. You never think of snails the same way again.
Where cockles are abundant, they attract the attention of a more aggressive mollusk. The moon snail can inflate its foot to 4 times the size of its entire shell.
Picture the Jaws music playing in the background.
A foot that serves as both a burrowing tool and a predatory weapon. The cockle, however, has a few tricks of its own. Its foot is a powerful digger, but it can also kick away forcefully when danger approaches. If the moon snail looses its hold, it can also burrow down and surprise a buried cockle. This time, the aggressor succeeds.
Can clams scream? I think he's screaming right now.
The moon snail's enormous foot begins to smother the hapless cockle. Even a hard shell can't stop the well-equipped moon snail, which can drill right through to feed on the animal within.
He said cockle. So next time you find one of those shells on the beach, you'll know exactly why. It also makes it really great to hang on a necklace then, too. Thank a snail for that. Really? Even like staring at it? Just going into it. Well, it's yeah. If you stop and think about it, it's pretty can be pretty intimidating. Tried to kill me once. I was lucky. Some lifeguard saved me. My board flew out. I got in a rip current. My board flew out, and my kids always had leashes on their boards after that. I was your guys' age, but I still go back. It took me a while to get back in though. But the monsters are inside are a whole other thing. There's critters everywhere, and shallower than you would think. Well, now we're scared to death of snails. Right? Exactly. You should be able to squash a moon snail. You might feel them nibbling on your toes. Then you just squish. All right, slightly less terrifying now. What are we looking at here? It says it's a fossil, but a fossil of a what? A fish. Yeah. Why do we know it's a fish? There we go. All right. We got to, though, like the last time, we need to entertain some other ideas if potential. That other thing, for most of us was obviously a footprint, but maybe it could have been a leaf, could have been a really big leaf that plants don't exist anymore. But it looks like a fish. We see fins. We see fish lips even. Yeah, there's a pretty good chance that's a fish. The funny part is the fact that it's so easy to tell that it's a fish actually makes them say, okay, wait a minute, what happened here? Because this is rare. What happens when something dies along the side of the road or on the shore or whatever? Something eats it usually, right? Starts chewing on it, if not, at the very least, bacteria. You could see all the soft, squishy bits on this thing, all the yummy parts, arguably. Which means that this is some pretty unordinary event happened. This got buried really quickly after it died. I keep talking about, this is a whole class. This is called taphonomy, and you could actually get like a doctorate in taphonomy. Stuff that happens after an organism dies, but before it becomes fossilized. What led up to that moment? And it's pretty insane. So a paleontologist who's into that kind of stuff would start thinking immediately, or send it to their friend who is into that kind of stuff. Okay, what do you think happened here? This guy probably got caught in we're going to call it a mudslide. This is obviously sand, but got caught in some sort of underwater landslide that just buried it. Immediately probably was still alive, but we see no predation on it at all. Amazing preservation. All right, you can see all the fish bone. If you've eaten a fish bone, if you've eaten fish, you know how thin fish bones can be. This is kind of, we talk about trying to make connections and so on and so forth. The best conversation I've had for this over the years is kind of how computer graphics have changed. All right, when I was a kid, we had Atari and Commodores and this, that's, and the other thing. Everything was built out of squares, and those squares weren't horribly small. And so whether you were playing Tank or Asteroids or Atari Ballerina or Ballet, they had that too. You were this weird little rectangle-y thing, okay? Then lo and behold, they decide to start using triangles. And they get smaller, and the dots get smaller, and everything gets smaller, and you could actually tell, not just that it's a ballerina, but you can see the sweat dripping down its face. So the pixels, we'll just loosely call them, okay, the way they've evolved is a great analogy for sediment and preservation. All right, the finer the grain, the way better the preservation is going to be. So this isn't a really fine grain sand. Or this could be a reproduction, and they just chose to make it tan. But this doesn't really look like mud in any case. But mud would be even greater detail because the silts and clays are so much a finer particle than the sand. So that's your resolution, okay? Is what you're preserving this stuff in. So fossils are typically altered remains of an organism. Sometimes you're lucky you get the whole organism, but as we started out this conversation, predation happens. Or if they happen to die near water moves stuff, okay? You're likely to find this a little gross, sorry, but, parts of an animal scattered down a stream bed, because that just, it happens. And again, predation. Somebody comes along, rips off an appendage, takes that off in the woods and munches on it. It's totally removed. So finding, we call this articulated still together, is really rare. So we've got some fish fossils in the lab if you ever want to see them. They're not as good as this one. So a fossil could be any critter. It could be any plant. So any organism. Sometimes forget that plants are organisms too. All right, next we've got mud cracks. Remember, this isn't just about critters. It's about the environments that they live in. So you may have seen something that looks like this, not probably this wide spread. Maybe somewhere that's a construction site. I think I have a picture really close to a curb in here somewhere. Anywhere where you get some mud that dries out. The weird thing about about silts and clays, is that when they get clay in particular, when it gets wet, it swells. And it's hydrophilic. You've heard of phobic, but hydrophobic before, and you've heard the word phobic. Philic is loving. It's the opposite of phobic. So clays are hydrophilic. They love water. So they suck all this water in, and they expand. But then when it gets hot and they dry out, they try to keep that same area that they held. And obviously, it's tough too, so what happens is it cracks, okay? Now, this is really fragile stuff here, but believe it or not, if a flood or something comes over, deposits some sediment in that, it could get preserved in the rock record. So now we know, a little bit about the environment than we did before. You could also argue that perhaps, if, depending on the size and shape of this, maybe you found a giant turtle shell. Okay, it kind of looks like a turtle shell. We don't know. So I'm not necessarily trying to be silly. I'm putting silly elements in, but the idea is that every generation has a bigger knowledge base than the previous generation. Okay, so you guys just say, oh, well, that's this. Well, 2 generations ago, it might not have been that easy for them to recognize, let alone, 300-400 years ago when we started doing all this stuff. Think back to the Greeks and Romans and all of their monsters that they created. There's a lot of research out there now that a lot of those things came from fossils. And their stories. We love to tell stories as humans, right? And there's some actually pretty intriguing work there where they say, depending on the area where they say this critter lived, we go there now and we find Triceratops fossils. Well, they were seeing, Triceratops fossils 2,000 years ago, didn't know what to make of them. They said, oh, there was this giant creature there that did, So, neat stuff. So, I'm telling you those are mud cracks, but that might not necessarily be the conclusion you came to if you wanted to crown it in the field. Yeah, here, I did take one next to the curb. This is somewhere on campus. And of course, this is going to get trampled over. This isn't going to get preserved in the rock record. But arguably that can form, anywhere. You also see it on the other side of the curve too. So again, this is all the difference between this and this is that a fine sediment washed in, filled in those cracks. It was allowed to dry out without anybody disturbing it. There you were. Cross-bedding. Again, I have some wonderful pictures of this from this past summer. I have not yet integrated them into my slides. This sets you guys up to think about cross-bedding with regards to land and water. I only want you to remember it with land. I want you to think sand dunes. Okay? Yes, this can happen in water, but I don't want to go that direction for this class. So we're going to kind of ignore the bottom two pictures. Why I didn't crop them out, I don't know. And I don't know if you've ever climbed a sand dune. You know they're really slippy things, and it's tough. Okay? Even without people climbing them, they shift. You can only pile up. It's called angle of inclination. It's been a long time since I had an engineering class, but I believe that's the word for it. Depending on the grain size of things, you can only pile them so steeply before they start to collapse. Just is. You learned that as a little kid, piling up rocks or blocks. You didn't know the word for it at the time. But it was only so high you could make a little pile of stuff. It's physics. Anywho, wind is constantly blowing and shifting the dunes. The dunes can only pile up so high, and then sometimes they have this mass movement, so to speak, where just everything slides. And dunes migrate if you've ever driven out west or in another country where there's a lot of sand. You know that sometimes they blow across the road and they need to come out with, the equivalent of snowplows, so to speak, and move this stuff back where it goes or put up fences to stop it. Dune grass is good too. But at any rate, that too can become lithified. And now you look at this and you say, okay, well, we know this area not just had a whole lot of sand, but sand that built up so much that it was, doing that sliding thing that my teacher talked about in class. And I think we were looking at sand dunes here. And then you start to think, okay, well, are we in a desert? Are we in an ocean? What was that environment? So then you got to look around for more clues. If you just see more and more and more sand, more than likely you might have been in a desert. If you start to see some marine sort of deposits, okay, then maybe this was a coastal dune. You could also sort of look at the sand grains itself. Again, beach sand tends to have more seashells and stuff in it, like your coquina breaking down, versus this kind of sand might be more like your sandstone specimen that you saw in lab number 3. It's just grains of rock broken down. So you could also make inferences like that. And I did see this a lot more frequently than I thought I would in Arizona. This one's not so cool. It's hard to beat cross-bedding, right? But graded bedding. What you're supposed to be observing here is the fact that the grains on the bottom are larger than the grains on the top. You notice that? Yeah, not too many people would. But a certain kind of geologist would. A different type of geologist would get it out of the way. You get down to whatever they needed to look at. But a certain kind of person would look at this. Just like certain doctors pick up different things than other doctors do. If you go to see one doctor versus another doctor. Like, well, how come the other doctor didn't notice this? Well, they're not looking for that. So this is subtle, but it's there. And so this distribution here of the grain sizes tells us that we were in some sort of standing pool of water, probably not big enough to have waves or anything like that, and that it had sediment regularly being dumped into it. And what we see here is that we actually have a lab for this. We don't always get to it. We have time for like one lab and lab report, and I kind of swap out which one we do. But you guys, I have you drop a whole bunch of sand down a 6-foot tube of water and report about how it settles in there. Also, exciting stuff. But the outcome, spoiler alert, is that the largest particles fall faster then the mediumer particles then do these smaller particles. It sorts itself out. Remember we talked about sorting the other day? All right. That can actually happen in still water too, just due to gravity, one of the other agents of weathering and erosion. So this tells somebody a little bit about an environment, and it's kind of cool to find a graded stone. And not only that, this is one of the rare instances where you can tell the top from the bottom of the stone. Because the big stuff's going to be on the bottom. All right, this one's a little more interesting, joking aside, because you can actually observe this one if you are lucky enough to get to a beach environment. I've seen them on the larger lakes even. You don't even have to get to the ocean. Okay? I've not seen the bottom one here, the asymmetrical, but I've seen plenty of the symmetrical. Ripple marks. Next time you're at the beach, I want you to pull your eyes off of all the people wandering around in bathing suits and look down at your feet. A, so you don't step on a jellyfish, and B, so you can see the cool sand designs. So we have two kinds of ripple marks. We have symmetrical and asymmetrical. Prefix A, someone remind us what it means? Not, yeah. So symmetrical and not symmetrical. Symmetrical ripple marks are from a bidirectional water environment, where asymmetrical ripple marks are from a unidirectional water type environment. What the hell does that mean? Bidirectional is waves, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The unidirectional is a stream. It only flows one way. And that water, while it's flowing, sculpts the sand. Yes, sir?
Wait a minute. The jellyfish stings you, it can kill you, right?
Depends on the jellyfish. Depends on the jellyfish. But you should always have a friend pee on your foot, regardless of the jellyfish. Because it supposedly helps. And it breaks the tension at the very least. But no, there's something about the urine that helps with the pain, the stinging. Has it really?
Yeah.
Then it must be about the tension then. Get the person to chill out. Well, it could be that. Not a whole lot of people looking for that excuse, but you know. There's always somebody willing to. Never mind. So, let's show a picture. Speaking of breaking the tension. So you may have seen this, okay? Again, I've seen it up on Lake Ontario dozens of times. You don't have to go to an ocean. But look through the water, kind of ankle-deep stuff, okay, as you're walking around, and you will see these ripple marks, and they're really cool. And they can get preserved in the rock record. And depending on whether or not these are kind of even, straight up and down peaks, the symmetrical ones, or leaning in a particular direction, the asymmetrical ones, you could tell whether you were standing on the shores of a really big lake or an ocean, or if you were standing on an old sandy stream bed. Now take it even a step cooler. If you were standing in an old sandy stream bed, you could tell what direction was downhill at the time, because those peaks would be pointing in the downward flow of water. But going back to our clueless hypotheses, we don't necessarily know what we're looking at. You could say ancient alien astronauts had a tank, and they drove that giant tank here. Okay? And those tank tracks got fossilized. Or you could come up with any number of things. So ripple marks. And again, all these are, if you've lost point of the point at this point, all these are just little subtle clues that we see in the rock record that give us a little bit more insight as to what was going on in the environment when that rock was created. And you might think, why the hell do we care? And I agree. Many times there's great reason to say that. But think back to, they've kind of gotten rid of dioramas, but back in the day, whenever they would put up fossils of dinosaurs or horses or whatever, they always felt the need to put a backdrop, right? And so you'd see this critter on some sort of backdrop, and that was to give you context again, right? Well, in an ideal world, they were using clues out of the rocks that these organisms were found in. All right. Now, it turns out sometimes we were horribly wrong. They always used to put the Brontosaurus in a swamp because they said, "Oh my gosh, this guy is so big that he couldn't support himself. He had to hang out in this swamp all day, so he floated." All right. He was in a lake, so we always drew giant marshy lakes behind the Brontosauruses and the Apatosauruses and whatnot. And then come to find out, well, no, actually they roam the fields. And Disney, Dinosaur, I don't usually quote Disney movies, but if you saw Dinosaurs, I think that was the name of it, plural, that was some amazingly accurate dinosaur life. They actually quoted, talked to some professionals and so on and so forth. So you see these things that we used to think could only support themselves in a swamp, rearing up on their hind legs, using their tails as ballast and stretching their legs up to the tops of these giant palm tree sort of things. Okay, totally misjudge their metabolism and so on and so forth. And maybe in 60 years we'll be changing that again too. You never know. But these all things at any rate. Back to the point was the pictures behind those, or in the pictures in books, and when they tell you about, they're not making this stuff up. Hopefully, all right. There's some of that going on. At least there was. Waxing poetic and whatnot. But they're pulling these clues out of the rocks. Okay? And there's that ruler that I told you about. So they give us tons of these things and we always forget them. This person remembered theirs. Otherwise, there'd be a rock hammer there for scale. Or a pencil or a lens cap. And there's more. Okay, there's brain impressions that make stuff look like a golf ball. There's I mentioned, like I said, tracks and trails to go back to ichnofossils. When I went out to Nebraska to get my zebra toes, which is what I studied for grad school, they had a cross-section as big as this wall of a set of, wasn't gophers, small little critter that scurries around. Not groundhogs, good gophers, an out west sort of critter. Prairie dogs, thank you. Prairie dog, whole, and tell me where they live now, too. Set of tunnels, at any rate, that they live in. A den, a burrow, a warren, something. Rabbits live in warrens. But it had gotten caught in a flood. All right, it looked like a big old Pac-Man maze with these sad little prairie dog skeletons stuck in the middle of it and everything. Kind of pitiful, kind of cool. But somebody had excavated that, reconstructed it in the thing there, and so we've got fossils, we've got trace fossils. And again, it tells us a little bit about the history there. Nebraska was full. It looked like the African plains that we see nowadays. All right, we had every kind of critter imaginable out there just a couple million years ago. It was really, really wild out there, literally and figuratively. Environments change. Environments change. So, at any rate, there's so much to see in there. And again, this is just a bit of a sampling for you guys.